Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and I'm on a major Beastmen kick lately. Obviously you know that there's a massive heatwave going around and hitting Gibraltar quite heavily, and because of that I've not been able to sleep and I've just been painting up around 50 Bestigors. And since I've been painting Beastmen, I've been thinking about the Beastmen too. You see, the Beastmen are one of the most diverse races in the Warhammer fantasy world, mostly because when the Great Catastrophe happened, loads of different human nations worldwide were hit and were mutated with their animals. That is what spawned the Beastmen race, and we're not going to go into a deep dive on that, but because of that, we know that there's loads of different types of Beastmen. Mostly, people will think on the most common types, the Gors, Ungors, and Bestigors, which are very much goats, the usual ones that most people meme about. Then there's obviously the Minotaurs, not too much explaining is needed there, and finally, a very well-known one are the Centaurs. They're not really centaurs, they're their own thing, this is something that we've been discussing. Those are the common types, and indeed, for the most part within the old world and a little bit beyond, these will be the most common forms of beastmen that you will see attacking your villages, destroying your cities, all the usual stuff. However, there are actually more different types that we never really hear about. They were mentioned about in lore a few times here and there, and it's a shame because it would make the faction a lot more interesting, I would say. So in this video, I want to discuss some of the lesser known Beastmen. So a minor mention goes to the Bovigors, mentioned in the Tome of Corruption in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition, and a few other places, but we don't really get a lot of information. Bovigors are those Gors who have cattle horns on their head and may have the entire head of a bull or ox. Bovigors are highly competitive and see themselves as superior to all other Gors. Most have little use for thinking, preferring instead to use their mighty strength to solve problems. So the Bovigors themselves might not sound as the most interesting thing until you realize, yeah, they're actually something very, very different. They're smaller than the standard Minotaurs, this is actually known through various other sources, and larger than the average Gaul. So they'd be not as powerful as the former, but stronger than the latter, and it's kind of interesting to think of that. It's another type of potential shock troop which you would see as a larger than average infantry unit. Oxen and cattle can be found throughout, well, pretty much the whole Warhammer Fantasy world, the civilized areas at the very least, so it's kind of curious that we've never actually seen Bovigors in action. To the south of the Warhammer Fantasy world, we hear of Apemen. In the old world, very little is known of the mysterious wilderness beyond Araby, which is known simply as the Southlands. It is known to the most erudite of old world scholars that as well as humans, the Southlands are home to species of large apes, animals which closely resemble primitive humanoids. Some of these are highly organized and intelligent, and use tools, weapons, and cunning in attacks on the other inhabitants of the jungles. When the lizard men or goblins pursue them, they vanish into the canopies of the great rainforests. At what point the ape ends and the beastmen begins is never clear, and the uncertainty of whether a creature is staring back at the traveler with animal curiosity or savage, chaos-bred malice makes the jungles even more treacherous and disconcerting. So obviously it's the same situation where man and beast fused and a beastman was born. I imagine that'd be very similar to, say, a gorilla, but, you know, just a bit smarter, hyper-intelligent by beast standards, but still relatively dumb by humanoid standards, I'd say. It's really, really cool to think that, yeah, in the jungles of the Southlands, there is a race of exotic-style beastmen which are hunting down the humans of the Southlands, hunting down pretty much anything around that area. Now, these Apemen are specific to the areas of the Southlands. It does raise a few questions, obviously, about how the Apemen and the Monkeymen within the border territories of Grand Cathay and the Kingdoms of Ind would work. Would they have been shaped by some form of chaotic powers, or are they something completely different? You see, these things can actually be quite different to each other while still being very, very similar. I imagine some distinction will be shown in the future if we ever get some more lore on Grand Cathay, which, yeah, we should expect the army book in Warhammer the Old World in a few years' time, as that's been stated that Grand Cathay is quite a while off, or through the eventual edition of the Monkey King through Total War Warhammer 3. Because I would love to know if they are shaped by chaos and broke away, or if they're just their own thing. And when I say that Beastmen are everywhere, I mean literally everywhere. So let's look towards the Dark Elf lands. Far across the wastes to the west lies the land called Nagaroth, the realm of the Dark Elves. Many creatures inhabit the Black Spines, from harpies through to mighty manticores and chimeras. So these are creatures that we already know. However, as well as these, a strange breed of scaled biped can sometimes be seen in the caves and crevices about the height of an elf and covered head to foot in craggy scales. These creatures are primitive and war amongst themselves with their stone axes and clubs. On occasion, when times are hard or when the call of chaos from the north grows strong, they descend from the peaks to raid dark elf settlements and join with the armies of chaos. And their numbers are such that it takes great military might to repel them. So this is pretty interesting because obviously we've never really heard of these before. I do wonder if they're related to the proto-lizardmen and the troglodytes, because the troglodytes themselves were biped, or well, still are biped creatures, which are very much like walking lizards, walking raptors. But since these scaled beastmen are further up north, they could be something completely different. We know the Dark Elves have an affinity to work with a lot of scaled creatures, not just the Medusae, but you know, they will tame cold ones, horned ones, and the like. So very likely they could be either troglodytes or a sub-race of sorts. Either way, it's a shame that we haven't really seen these because, I mean, it does sound kind of cool. And more variety for the Beastmen is always kind of fun. Now, we can't talk about the Beastmen without talking about the Snakemen, also known as the Naga of Koresh. So we don't know exactly if these are considered beastmen or not. It's a very curious thing. Some people have speculated that the Snakemen would have been a form of proto-lizardmen, and yes, a lot of them could have fallen to chaos, mutated even further, and created the race that we know and fear so far. Early models do suggest that the Snakemen themselves were part of the chaos roster. They were called Chaos Snakemen, so it could be possible, yes, that some Snakemen do still follow the Chaos Gods in a very similar way to how the normal Beastmen do. Not really dedicated, but more in an undivided sense, or with their own Chaos God to begin with. There could be a great snake that lives in the hypothetical underground of the Warhammer Fantasy world. I imagine that as the years progress through Warhammer the Old World and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, we'll start to get more information, but they remain an enigma. Again, I still believe that they have some ties to Chaos in some way, shape, or form, but yeah, time will tell. Especially since an old map, which many people reference with regards to Beastmen concentrations, puts into that area, Koresh, as quite heavily corrupted. Though it is important to note that that map is horrendously outdated, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the video. Again, another disputed one is the Tigermen. You see, in the Kingdoms of Ind, we do know of Beastmen who seem to be more intelligent than the ones that we see in the Drakworld Forest. Not only are they organized, but they seem to trade with the local communities, offering them protection as long as they're getting their tributes. These Tigermen themselves are seen as noble but fickle beings, and they will also attack Indish settlements if they see a reason to, which makes a lot of people speculate that maybe there are some good in Warhammer Fantasy terms, Tigermen elevated by any patron deity which might represent Cants, as we know that the lands of Ind have thousands and thousands of gods, but there could also be others which might have been corrupted by the Chaos Gods themselves, so there might actually be a sect of Tigermen potentially following Khorne, Nurgle, Sinesh, Tzeentch, or maybe another. The thing is, there are many Chaos Gods, and we only really speak about the main four and a few minor ones. Perhaps some deity within the pantheon of Ind could also be considered a Chaos God and acts under its own part within the great game. Even then, Tigermen are freaking awesome, and I imagine that the Kingdoms of Ind will also be a host to many different exotic types of beastmen too. However, from all that we've discussed, the most interesting of all might be the Lakemen. Lakemen are a variety of beastmen found primarily in the Lyon region of the Forest of Arden, though they swim out to plague the rest of southern Lyonesse with depressing frequency. They all have a vaguely amphibian appearance, often with faces resembling frogs, pincers in place of hands, and gills allowing them to breathe underwater. However, they are more variable than normal beastmen, and all Lakemen have at least one other other mutation. Lakemen prefer to attack from the water as this gives them the advantage of surprise in most cases. But they are no more adept in water than any other skilled swimmer. Whilst they are as violent and bloodthirsty as beastmen, the two groups have never been observed to cooperate and have been known to fight each other for no readily apparent reason. The fact is that amphibian beastmen do actually exist, and it's quite important to note because again it shows the variety of what we've been able to see. Many people might link these guys to the fishmen, and we're going to talk about the fishmen in a separate video. We're going to go through all the Lakemen lore, fishmen lore, and all the potential eldritch horrors that do kind of link up to that. But Lakemen could in fact just be standardized beastmen, just, you know, people who lived close to lakes, people who lived close to rivers, who dealt with frogs, who dealt with fish, and when the great catastrophe finally hits, well, unfortunately they were fused into that and became a race of their own. Now, very old cartographers were able to make this map. What you can see is it's pretty outdated. Obviously, Bretonia seems a lot smaller. The map distribution is obviously a bit weird. Cathay was originally in the southern parts of the Warhammer world rather than the northern parts. That was eventually switched over with Koresh. But what you can see is that there is a massive concentration of beastmen warbands in loads of locations. Naturally, in the northern parts, in the southern Chaos Race, it makes a lot of sense. That's where Chaos is the strongest. But I imagine that things wouldn't really change too much. What's curious is we do see some beastmen in Nippon, which we know there's a lot of animals which could be its own unique beastmen there too. It's a weird thing where people look towards beastmen and they just see goats, goats, and more goats. Whereas, yeah, we know in lore, even with minor mention, that birdmen exist. Again, Cathay does kind of link towards onyx crowmen, but some people theorize that we might see other types of beastmen. For example, in the jungles of the Southlands, there could be parrot beastmen. We know again that caprigors are a thing, and they're not just the goats, but there's also sheep-like beastmen running around the herds with the standard gores. It's just we never really see them implemented into miniatures or even most fiction. The beast fiends in the south would be, well, demonic style beastmen. We've spoken about them in a lot of detail in the previous video. You can check that out if you wish. And I imagine there's a lot more that we just haven't even heard about that maybe Warhammer historians haven't been able to see, that might be stuck in Games Workshop's vault as basic ideas, basic concepts. You never know for the future, however, as Warhammer the Old World gets closer and closer. You never know. A lot of these things and weird, wonderful creatures, and terrifying creatures at that too, have been coming back into the lore very slowly through Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, or even Total War Warhammer. Both of them have been approved by Games Workshop, so who knows what we might see in the future. But let me know what types of creatures you're hoping to see for the Beastmen in the comments below, and let's start a bit of a discussion. Until then, I'll see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.